When most people think of the Vietnam War, they picture American helicopters, jungle firefights, and a Cold War battleground between communism and democracy. But the truth is, the roots of this conflict run much deeper, and long before the first American boots hit Vietnamese soil, another empire had already fought and lost in the same jungles. This is the story of France's colonial war in Vietnam, and how a series of overlooked decisions set the stage for one of America's longest and most painful conflicts. Vietnam was part of French Indochina, a colony France had controlled since the mid-1800s. For decades, the Vietnamese people lived under colonial rule, their resources exploited, their culture suppressed, and their voices silenced. But one voice would not be silenced. Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known as Ho Chi Minh, emerged as a leading voice for Vietnamese independence. He spent years abroad, studying, organizing, learning from revolutionaries. And in the aftermath of World War I, he tried something remarkable. He reached out to the United States. In 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, Ho Chi Minh wrote to President Woodrow Wilson. He pleaded for support, invoking the principles of self-determination that Wilson had promoted, but his message never reached the president. It was ignored, or perhaps buried, by colonial officials and diplomats, who saw no advantage in helping a colonized Asian nation. Decades later, after World War II, Ho tried again. When Japan surrendered in 1945 and left a power vacuum in Vietnam, Ho declared independence. On September 2nd, in Hanoi, he stood before a crowd and read from the US Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. He believed the United States, champion of anti-colonialism during the war, might finally support Vietnam's freedom. So he wrote again, this time to President Harry Truman. Between 1945 and 1946, Ho sent at least 8 letters, asking the United States to recognize Vietnam's independence and warning of the dangers of allowing France to return. But Truman never saw those letters. They were intercepted by officials in the US State Department, some pro-French, others suspicious of Ho's leftist ties. They either downplayed or outright blocked the messages from ever reaching the president. To them, Ho Chi Minh was already drifting toward communism, and France was too valuable an ally in post-war Europe to alienate. So instead of recognizing Vietnam's independence, the US backed France's return. What could have been a partnership became a proxy war. Ho, having been rejected by the West, turned to the East, accepting aid from the Soviet Union and China. But it's important to remember, communism, for Ho, was a strategy. His true goal was always independence. In 1946, the French returned to Vietnam, sparking the First Indochina War. It would last 8 brutal years. France underestimated the resolve of the Vietnamese people. Despite superior firepower and international support, the French struggled to hold territory. The Viet Minh, Ho's guerrilla army, fought a relentless campaign for national liberation. The war reached its turning point in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. French forces, entrenched in a valley in northern Vietnam, were surrounded by Viet Minh troops and decisively defeated. It was a humiliating loss for France, and the final blow to its colonial ambitions in Southeast Asia. At the Geneva Conference later that year, the major powers agreed to a temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's government would control the north. A French-backed anti-communist regime would hold the south. National elections were promised for 1956 to reunify the country. But those elections never came. Why? Because US officials feared the outcome. President Dwight Eisenhower later admitted that 80% of the population would have voted for Ho Chi Minh. Instead of supporting democracy, the US supported division. The United States quickly recognized the South Vietnamese government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, a devout Catholic, a staunch anti-communist, and a man with little support among his own people. With French influence fading, the US stepped in to take its place. At first, American involvement was limited. Advisors were sent to help train the South Vietnamese army. Money and equipment flowed in. By 1955, the US had taken over much of the financing of South Vietnam's military. By 1960, there were nearly 1,000 US military advisors on the ground. But South Vietnam was deeply unstable. Diem's regime became increasingly repressive. His persecution of Buddhists and political opponents alienated huge swaths of the population. The insurgency grew. In the north, Ho Chi Minh provided support to communist rebels in the south, now known as the Viet Cong. To Washington, it looked like another domino was about to fall. And so, slowly, the United States escalated, first with more advisors, then with special forces. Then, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, an attack on US ships that remains clouded in controversy, America's full-scale military involvement began. By 1965, tens of thousands of combat troops were in Vietnam. The war was no longer a support mission. It was America's war now. But few Americans realized the conflict they were stepping into had already lasted decades. It wasn't just about communism. It wasn't just about the Cold War. It was about empire, independence, betrayal, and the road not taken. Ho Chi Minh was never simply a Soviet puppet. He had once looked to America for help. He had quoted Thomas Jefferson. He had asked for friendship, and America said no. To truly understand the Vietnam War, we must look back, before the first Marine landed, before the first draft notice was mailed, because long before it became America's war, it was Vietnam's struggle for freedom. And that story is far more complicated than ideology. By the time the last American troops left Vietnam in 1973, over 58,000 American service members had lost their lives. Tens of thousands more were wounded, physically and emotionally. Many came home to a country that didn't understand the war, and sometimes didn't understand them. They were asked to fight in a war shaped by geopolitics, misinformation, and missed opportunities. A war that had begun as a Vietnamese fight for independence, but evolved into a symbol of Cold War confrontation. They weren't fighting for conquest. They weren't fighting to suppress freedom. Many didn't even fully understand why they were there, but they answered the call. They did their duty, often with courage, honor, and sacrifice. Far from home, in brutal conditions, against an enemy that could not be easily defined. They fought not for glory, but for the men beside them, for survival, for country. We can question the motives behind the war. We can examine the mistakes made by leaders. We can speak honestly about how the United States became entangled in a conflict it didn't fully understand. But we must never forget the human cost. The young Americans who served and died in Vietnam deserve our respect. Not because the war was noble, but because they showed nobility in the face of chaos. Their sacrifice was real, their courage undeniable, and that too shall not be forgotten.